I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. So I thought to streamline things, we could skip discussing issues that you raised in the chapter on being, because if we talk about language and time, we'll have plenty of occasion, right, to enter into being. So,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
true.
so I thought we would just start with language. And since Heidegger, right, is a representative of phenomenology, I thought I would start with this observation that you have in your chapter on language in your Heidegger and Kabbalah book. It came out in 2019. The point is that understanding doesn't come from listening. You have to already understand in order to listen. And that the poet Paul Celan, when reading that, he wrote a note, Phenomenology. If you recall that, could you expand on that? Why Celan would write Phenomenology?
What I surmised here is that Celan discerned, and I'm quoting, that the
Mhm,
acoustic images specified by Heidegger in that context, the creaking wagon, the
mhm,
motorcycle, the marching column, the north wind, the woodpecker tapping, and the crackling fire, provide an elemental path to get back to the things themselves, as Husserl famously defined the phenomenological task. So I think that's, yeah, um, that's what I meant. That's how I interpreted what Ceylon meant
mhm.
by marking this passage from being in time as phenomenology.
Yeah, and I thought it was would just form a beautiful, a quick uh, introduction, so to speak, of what phenomenology is, since it's such a massive and complicated subject, right? To have, I think, a beautiful example would be helpful. I know that all the listeners won't be
Yeah,
exposed to phenomenology, but those who want to dive in, well, the first thing they need to do is, of course, buy your book. Um, Another point you raise that quote unquote spoke to me is that, right, to keep silent is not to be mute, right? So speaking not is not the same thing as not speaking.
yeah,
So Heidegger's emphasis on silence really is it's not being made because he's a proponent, for instance, of the impressionistic cult of silence, for instance. But
no,
that's
no,
right,
not at all. No.
right. So could you tell us more about what Heidegger has written about silence?
Yes, so this is one of the themes that actually runs through his corpus, and it's very conventional to view Heidegger as an early Heidegger, a later Heidegger after the
Mhm,
so-called turn in the 30s. And while there's some validity to that, and in fact Heidegger is the one who introduced this language of the Ker, or the turn, we should always keep in mind that a turn on a path means that you're both continuous and discontinuous. That's what a turn on a path is.
mhm,
And so there are several themes which are constantly invoked by Heidegger, and this is one of them, that you find it in Being in Time, and you find it in his later thought as well, that speech originates in silence. It's what he eventually calls the siegetic origin of language. So, what does he mean by that? And um, I want to here, if I may, I want to read
Sure.
a comment he made on the way to language, which was published in a collection in 1959. And I think it really well responds to your question.
All right.
In translation, it reads, "To say and to speak are not identical. A man may speak endlessly, and all the time say nothing. Another man may remain silent, not speak at all, and yet, without speaking, say a great deal." So that silence that Heidegger identifies as the origin of language and that to which all language returns is the unspoken. And the unspoken is what remains unsaid in every saying. And that's why he privileges the poetic, because he feels that the poetic incarnates this truth more than all other forms of speech. And if I could just add one additional point here,
Yes.
this relationship between the unspoken and the spoken is for him the mystery, the geheimnis, right? And
Right.
the mystery in the sense that that which remains unspoken and is held back in what is said, the unsaid in the said, corresponds to his idea that every disclosure is perforce at the same time a concealment, or every truth is at the same time an untruth.
Hmm. Well, to broaden this further, another point you make, which is a very important point, at least for me, um, right, from the perspective of cognitive science, linguistics, and the question of origin of language, right? So Heidegger, um, I believe you wrote something to the effect that he turns the Western model upside down, or something to that effect, when he argues that language is not primarily verbal communication, with words being symbols signifying beings outside the mind.
Right.
Right. So, could you elaborate on that? Because that's really, really, it does turn the whole Western model on its head.
Yeah, so, right. So that kind of correlation between language and beings is something that he, is pushing against. Of course, he doesn't deny that language has that social function,
Sure.
communication, but that's not its primary or primordial sense. So, um, what what in fact is the primordial sense of language is what we just were discussing. The famous statement, "Language is the house of being."
Hmm.
So, what does he mean by that? In what sense is language the house of being? Well, again, I think he means by that is that language provides the clearing, the Lichtung, the opening by which being manifests itself by being concealed in beings. Right? So that's what he sees as the primary task of language. And again, that's why he would privilege the poetic.
Mm.
Now, I mean, I should add, it's quite obvious that there's an anthropocentrism here, because Heidegger insists that only Dasein, his term for the human being,
Hmm.
has language, right? And there's all kinds of more current scientific research that allocates some form of language to different species, elephants, dolphins, and so on. And Heidegger would reject all of that.
Hmm. Because he would then be somewhat like, I guess, like Noam Chomsky also would say that language, right, is specific to the Homo sapiens sapiens and all other animals, right? Right, they may have communication, but they don't have language, right? But as you
Yeah,
say, of course, this is being called into question, but right, it all depends upon one's definition of language, also, right? That's why Chomsky can get away with this. He has a particular definition of language. But
right. But that would be akin to Heidegger's insistence that animals don't speak.
right, and
If we define language by communication,
no, sure,
but that's precisely what he's resisting. Uh,
yes,
Yeah. The other thing, though, there's still he also is very um, engaged with Aristotle's definition of the human as the rational animal or the animal that speaks,
hmm,
that has logos. Now, he doesn't totally reject it, but he also doesn't accept it as on its face. And for because for Heidegger too, the logos is what marks the specificity of the human being. But as we were saying before, the relationship between being and thought or being and language for Heidegger isn't a one-to-one correlation.
hmm,
That something in internally in our brains corresponds to something externally in the world. So he tries to redefine that relation of the subjective and the objective.
hmm,
And they belong together, but in Heidegger's distinctive sense of belonging together, that means they're the same in virtue of their difference.
hmm. And I know a couple times you made the observation that Heidegger's strategy there enables him to avoid this classical conundrum or this irresolvable debate between realism and idealism.
Right.
Right. And I think also I remember in my youth, going back quite a ways, I remember maybe the first time or second time I had read Sein und Zeit, that Heidegger made the point, and I'm paraphrasing, um, that humans don't have language. Humans don't speak language. Language speaks the human.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Paraphrasing, right? But do you have any thoughts on that observation?
Yeah, he does. He does articulate matters in that way. If uh, if we heed the comment I referred to before, that he says, in thinking, being comes to language, and then
Hmm.
he makes the famous statement: "Language is the house of being.
Hmm.
In its home, human beings dwell."
Hmm.
Right. So, it, for Heidegger, well, what is constitutive of what? Is the language constitutive of the human or human of the language? He seems to suggest it's the former,
Hmm.
right? Because
Right.
language, again, the metaphor that he uses here, language is the home in which human beings dwell.
Hmm.
So there is some sense of autonomy or independence.
Hmm.
However, the point I was making before, the two belong together for Heidegger. You can't disentangle the two. You can't find language without Dasein
Mhm.
or Dasein without language. Yet it's precisely in their belonging together that we can appreciate their separateness.
Mhm. Right. Right. Well, when I first read that particular point in Heidegger, um, that we don't speak, right? Speech, just bubbles up in us and presents itself through us. Immediately thought of a point that Chomsky again has made, and he's not the only one, right? That as you and I speak with each other, we're not consciously choosing each and every word that we're speaking. Right? This is being generated mostly by unconscious or automatic processes, and they're bubbling up, which is a really nice ancient metaphor uh, used by a lot of religious texts and philosophical texts as well. But this language bubbling up, right, as an just something that's as if it right is beyond us, right. And that's of course how we experience the unconscious. It's almost autonomous then, right? And so that's the way I've always. That's the prism through which I've tried to understand that. I guess you could call it that aphorism of Heidegger, but I've always felt that it doesn't plumb the depths of it. Of course, right? One has to get into his concept, as you have, of poetry and poetic speech and all the implications of that. Um,
Yeah, and being you would want for on Heideggerian terms, I mean, I think you would want to avoid being reductive,
mhm,
um, because language obviously is intricately involved with being, which which we chose not to discuss as a separate topic, but obviously it's implicated here
yes, yes.
because yeah. So, again, to invoke that famous statement, language is the house of being,
Mm,
which he doesn't mean beings, he means being.
mhm,
And he's always maintaining that ontological difference between being and beings.
yes.
So it's not an unconscious process for him, but it's more that Dasein is the being there that oh, that's the guardian or the shepherd of the Lichtung, the opening,
Mhm,
the lighting up, where being manifests itself in beings by concealing itself in those very beings.
right. Yes, yes. And then so as another point that he makes then, right, language. Let's see. Language springs from, right, and it preserves the event of being. Is
Yeah,
another way of looking at it. Yes, yes,
right, right.
right.
So I mean, what he calls the event, Ereignis, and Lichtung, it's very hard to actually differentiate. I mean, he's clearly using two different terminological
Mhm,
registers,
mhm,
but he seems to be articulating the same phenomenon.
mhm. Right. Well, I can't help but ask this question, and if you want to, you can decline. But in this chapter, you discuss Heidegger's contention, right, that we can't invent a new language, right, but we can extend language beyond its limit, right, to the essence of language. And various examples are given, right, of certain phrases that Heidegger used, which are apparent examples of this type of ability to extend language. But when I read your work, Elliot, including this book, Heidegger and Kabbalah, you have a distinctive style, and it's so. My question is this your? consciously or unconsciously, what do you think of this? It seems to me that this your writing is almost an example of this extension of language beyond its limits, right? To get to the essence of language. All right, is this something you're doing as a conscious discipline, or is it, or am I just reading too much into your style?
Oh, well, first, I'm honored that you cast my work in those terms. Obviously, it's a great honor for me to receive that from you. Well, I work very hard at it. Yes, it's certainly a conscious effort on my part. I've I don't know if I, at this point it's kind of hard for me to keep track of you know everything that I've written. So I don't know if this shows up in my writing, but I'm certain that I've articulated this in lectures. I don't think the gap between the adept and the scholar
Mhm,
is so profound. And
mhm,
one of the areas that bridges the two for me is precisely what you're getting at here. I mean, the language that I use to analyze and explicate, interpret these texts is proportionate to the texts themselves. There's a commensurability
mhm.
between the rhetoric that I myself am crafting and what I'm trying to impart, about these texts. So yeah, I do. And since I've been so much engaged with this question of the limits of language through language, of
Mhm.
course, right?
Yes.
Not by the speaking, not as opposed to not speaking. So I see that when I'm engaged in our exercises in speaking, not
Mhm.
the apophatic, which in the end is a gesture of speaking.
Yes. Yes.
I was recently through Zoom at a conference, and someone said, I'll leave out the names here,
Sure.
to protect the guilty.
All right.
But this person said the whole of Lurianic Kabbalah is an assault on negative theology. And I said, I didn't say anything, but I said to myself, no, it's just the opposite. It's not an assault on negative theology because that statement presumes a bifurcation between the apophatic and the cataphatic, and
Yes.
thereby misses the whole point. Michael Sells' wonderful title, Mystical Languages of Unsaying.
Mhm.
But they're languages nonetheless, right?
That's right.
So, yeah.
Well, it's ironic, it's paradoxical, and for me, honestly, sometimes a bit amusing that um, apophatic thinkers who have written, right, can go on for hundreds of pages. And I'm thinking especially of uh, classical authors and pre-modern theologians. They could go on for hundreds of pages, if not thousands, right?
Right,
Stating over and over and over that this subject is beyond words. It's ineffable, and it's apophasis, but it's going on for
right,
hundreds, if not
right.
thousands, of pages, right? And
So that of which we cannot speak, we can speak endlessly.
yes, yes, yes. Uh, I think something else that distinguishes your work from most other academic exegesis of traditional Kabbalistic texts, right, is that you're not only interpreting the texts, right, in an academic fashion, availing yourself of all the academic methodologies that we have access to, but you're also performing uh, philosophical contributions, right? So you're actually contributing to the history of philosophy. You're just not interpreting the texts right? And as such, right? And so I don't want to name names either. I want to protect the guilty, but there's a lot of academic Kabbalistic publications, and they try to tell us what Moses Cordovero or Luria meant, right, in what they taught, right? But there's it seems that at the same time, many of these academicians, it's almost as if they might be embarrassed, I imagine, right, to be perceived as, well, actually taking seriously, right, what these pre-modern texts had to say, right? Apart from, how does one want to understand these texts on a personal level? But so apart from that, but it seems to me that that a lot of scholars may be reticent to jump in and to actually experience or try to understand, right, what these pre-modern authors were thinking when they were writing. And so, what I appreciate about your writing is that, yeah, you're interpreting these texts as a scholar, but you're also contributing and widening our actual knowledge, right, of how to do philosophy, right? So.
Well, again, thank you for that. I'm very appreciative for that degree of sensitivity to what I've been doing all these years.
Well, it also pertains to, for instance, to what you've written about time, and we'll be discussing that in a little bit here. But
Hmm.
you've written quite a bit about time, scattered through different works, and then one of your latest works is quite a heavy tome uh,
Yeah, yeah,
uh, on time. And again, one can see that you are engaged with the thought, right, of these pre-modern authors, right? Just not as a scholar wanting to interpret them for a general audience who's interested in these topics, but you come across as actually being interested, right, in these questions, these metaphysical questions. What is time, right? And so I know that there's even a trend, right, in academia against this type of almost personal investment, right,
yeah,
right, in these pre-modern sources. But it seems to me that, hey, life is pretty damn short, right? And so Heidegger, right, had this meme or this trope about what was it, Sein or Dasein zum Tode, right, being towards death. I mean, that's what it's all heading for, right? And so
hmm,
it seems to me a potential waste of one's time and even one's life, right, to spend decades as a scholar uh, interpreting Kabbalistic texts or Sufi texts or what have you, and never never jumping into the thought world, right, of those authors. Right, so it just remains um, just
yeah,
right, is it just a head trip, in other words, an ego problem perhaps, but well, anyway, I feel like I'm
yeah.
rambling there.
Well, but I also think, as if it's again based on a very false dichotomy, um, as if as if the experiential discredits the scholarly objectivity.
Right.
But to me, that really that has never made sense to me. Although it's true, it's true that I trained in an academic environment and I learned the philological, textual, and historical skills that I needed.
Mm,
But it never made sense to me uh, to impose that dichotomy on what I was giving my time to
mm,
study. Just didn't make sense to me.
right.
So people say to me, do you meditate? And I kind of laugh. I mean, have you read one page of what I've written? How could you ask that question?
A good point. Yeah, that's a good point. And, and
But they're probably reading it with the lens that's crafted out of that dichotomy, you know.
mm, right,
So
right. The last point that I had thought to discuss on language was this point of concealment and revelation, because after all, this book is titled Heidegger and Kabbalah. And here I
right,
think there's a marvelous overlap, right, between Heidegger's thought and Kabbalah, as varied as that is, right? This
right,
whole paradigm of concealment and revelation, and that something is revealed uh, because it's hidden, and the mystery is known by preserving the mystery as such, right?
right.
And this is a thread that goes throughout your work over the decades. So, um, could you just tell us a little bit about this model that you've developed?
Yes. So is it indeed correct? It is a thread that weaves through my work now for many years. Uh, well, I think perhaps the best way to approach it would be the more conventional understanding would be the esotericism promulgated by the Kabbalists um, is aligned with the political stance of Maimonides, namely that uh, the mysteries of Torah, as he refers to them using the rabbinic locution, are secrets that need to be withheld for political reasons. In the case of Maimonides, because they may challenge certain viewpoints that were critical to anchoring traditional faith, such as the immortality of the soul, the world to come, and so on. Right. And so, analogously, for the masters of the esoteric tradition, the Kabbalists, they know what the secret intends. They can reveal it to a group of initiates,
Mhm.
but it's withheld from the larger communities. My feeling was this: while this may be sometimes at play in the Kabbalistic literature, it didn't really get to the heart of what seemed to me to be the case, namely that there's an ontological understanding of mystery here.
Mhm.
That is to say, that the secret deals with something that is inherently incommunicable. Right?
Mhm.
Now, this is a little different than what Sholem says. Sholem also says in his unhistorical aphorisms that the tradition, he also, well, it's similar, it's somewhat similar. He does say that the tradition that is disclosed is not the authentic tradition, because the authentic tradition is something that cannot be transmitted, cannot be communicated. So there is a point of analogy between my thinking and Sholem, but I think I go one step further insofar as I articulated more the paradox that even that it's precisely through the communication that the incommunicable is preserved,
Mhm.
because it's the nature of the mystery that it's withheld in its mysteriousness nature, but that withholding can only come about through its bestowing. Right.
Mhm.
So, to give the one example that I often invoke is Kabbalists famously spoke of the Sod du Partsufim, the
Mhm.
secret of the androgyne. Now, do they think literally that the God of Israel is a male and a female? such that the unity of that God is realized through the conjunction of the two? No, they didn't literally believe it to be so, by all accounts. But they also didn't simply think of this as an allegorical depiction. Right? There's something about the mystery of the endogene that even the master doesn't fully comprehend. But that's the point. It's precisely in its incomprehensibility that the secret dwells. Yeah, right. And Heidegger sometimes uses very similar language to characterize what he understands by the nature of the mystery. He writes, Heidegger, that which shows itself and at the same time withdraws is the essential trait of what we call the mystery. Right? And then in another passage, he's describing the unheimlich, or the uncanny, which is the counterpoint to Geheimnis, the mystery. And in the German Geheimnis, you hear the word Heim, right?
Yes.
Right in the center of the word. So, in describing the sense of the unhomely or the uncanny, he writes about the mystery. It is that what looms forth in the essence of the human being, and is that which stirs in all stirring and arousal, that which presences and at the same time absences. Right? You see, once again, we see the two processes happening simultaneously or concomitantly. So it's not a disclosure followed by a concealment. But in the disclosure itself is a concealment, and in the concealment is the disclosure. That which, again, he defined mystery as that which shows itself and at the same time withdraws. That's the essential trait of the mystery. And I think that works very well for what's going on in so many of the Kabbalistic sources.
Yes. Well, let's switch now to some of the topics that you discussed rather deftly and deeply in the chapter on time space. And I'll start off with a question. Could you just give us a summary or elaborate as much as you want to on how the Kabbalist views the subject of time and eternity differently, right, than the Platonic and Middle and Neoplatonic tradition. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Right. So, well, that's of course, a very large topic.
well, maybe it would be helpful for me to use one of the main examples you use, and that is, right, the rabbinic trope that the Torah was created 2,000 years before the world was made, and so therefore, right, before time was there.
Well, if we understand time as somehow connected to physical entities.
Yes.
Right. Right. So, if we undercut that connection, which I think the that's what the Kabbalists are trying to affirm, that we shouldn't measure time by bodies in motion, or even think of time as a fleeting shadow of eternity, which would be the Platonic idea that filters into Neoplatonism. So this is a third conceptualization of time. That is the diurnal and nocturnal rhythms of divinity itself. So they refer to this using another rabbinic locution, the Seder Zmanim, according to a passage in Breshit Rabbah. The order of times, the Seder Zmanim, preceded time itself, because time the rabbis there were assuming, that time, Zman itself, has to be linked to the universe. But there was, prior to the universe and prior to the time that is appropriate to the physical universe, there were these orders of time. So, although it's a different tradition that you cited, the common denominator here would be the same. Namely, there is some space of time that is before time. Now, the Kabbalists take that and apply it to the elan vital of the divine. It's the impulse of the divine. It's the living impulse of the divine. So the question is Ein Sof outside of that? That's a large question.
Yes.
Yeah. But so, in a nutshell, that's how I would understand their operative idea of time. So then, time in our more calculative sensibility participates in that other notion of time.
Mm-hmm. Right, which you've called temporality, which is the term that Heidegger
Right.
used as well. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yes. Right. Well, actually it doesn't seem illogical to me at all. This rabbinic trope, this idea that the Torah was created 2,000 years before the world, right? I think it was Matthew Crippen pointed out to me once that, right, and I've heard this from very esteemed physicists. They say, well, it doesn't make any sense at all to ask what happened before the Big Bang, because before the Big Bang there was no time. But actually, that statement, right, is an example of a logic 101 error, right? Because that question makes eminent sense, because what it is asking is for the logical antecedents. And so,
Right.
so even if we assume, right, that time depends on physicality, it's not necessarily an illogical idea, right, to talk about something being created 2,000 years before the physical world. But in any case, something that is of more interest, right, is then how Heidegger deals with imagination and time, right? So it's and you explore this. It's very interesting. It's very challenging, right? This sometimes I would call it how he correlates imagination and time, but sometimes he outright identifies the two, albeit I'm sure always with some qualification somewhere nearby. But he posits this imagination, right, can occur only in time,
Right.
and and then yes, the power of imagination is time in the sense of temporality, right? So, in any case, I guess what I'm asking you is, what is your understanding of how Heidegger relates imagination to temporality? Because this seems to me a very, very profound
Yeah.
area of inquiry. And you do point out that Heidegger, right, went sort of back and forth, but it seemed that always he was privileging the time over space.
When you look at being in time, no one, I think, would question that there's a kind of tempocentrism there, right?
Yes.
Where he privileges the temporal and what you invoked before, being toward death. That obviously is another facet of the privileging of temporality. But then he does seemingly shift, and he starts to speak after the so-called turn of a more hyphenated reality of time-space.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that time-space is indexical of the essence of truth, which is grasped and grounded in the clearing. Now, they belong together. He does often say this as well, namely, time and space belong together primordially. But he's not talking about space and time that we experience through a more calculative reasoning.
Right.
They, topos for space and chronos for time, are derivative from Ram and Zeit. Right? Now, this time space, okay, so the characteristic of that time space arises from an inceptual act that is concomitantly a constriction and an expansion. Okay? The constriction is tied to Zeit.
The expansion is tied to space then.
Right, to the spatial coordinate. Right. Now, so then now I'm getting to your question. Does he really overcome the tempocentrism of his earlier thinking? I don't think so myself, although I have to acknowledge that there are Heideggerians that would disagree with what I'm about to say. And that is that it still seems to me that it's the temporal that bestows the opening that makes room for the spatial. Right? So, for instance, in one passage, he says that time should become experienceable as the ecstatic playing field of the truth of being. Transposition into the cleared region is supposed to ground the clearing itself as the open realm in which being gathers itself into its essence. And then he goes on to speak of the crossing over of time into space. That's what he means by that transposition. So it still seems to me that he kind of privileges time as the grounding of space.
Right. Time grants space.
Yeah, time grounds space. Yeah. We could also think of his time space as the fourth dimension, which I think I also discuss a little bit.
Right. Einstein and Minkowski 4D space-time. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Which seemed to have an impact on him, at least for a certain period in his writings.
Yeah, no, he was engaged in conversation, with quantum physicists. Yeah,
Right.
no question about that.
So I think around that period, he would be saying that the unity of the temporalizing and spatializing would constitute the essence of beingness.
Right, but understood again as this play of constriction and expansion, which of course, was amazing to me in terms of the resonance in the Kabbalistic material, especially the Lurianic.
What you're alluding to the trope of Tzimtzum.
The Tzimtzum, followed by the Hitpashtut.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And another way, Tzimtzum is sometimes referred to as Histalkut, right? So
Right.
that would be an exact philological analog.
Yes. Again, it's not so important, this question of whether this Kabbalistic thought actually historically influenced Heidegger, but the parallelism is striking in itself as such. It's striking.
I mean, if one wanted to kind of just develop this from terms of historical influence, the critical person would be Schelling. Now,
Right.
I don't know that Heidegger was aware of Schelling's relationship to the Kabbalah, but to me that's irrelevant
Mm.
and
Yeah.
immaterial.
Mhm.
But I think he most definitely picked up on some elements of the Kabbalistic symbolism and doctrines via Schelling.
Yes, yes. And I know you mentioned at least one in the particular chapter where it's a possibility, at least the way you phrase it, that Heidegger had picked up a certain point from Schelling, and Schelling in turn may have picked that up from Jakob Burma.
From Jakob Böhme, right, right.
Yes, yes. So, is there this probably indirect influence through Schelling, perhaps, on Heidegger, right, from of Burma's concept of the Ungrund?
Of the Ungrund, yeah, which
Mhm,
Heidegger calls the Abgrund, but
mhm, yeah.
yes, yeah, I think so. Independently, I'm pretty sure he read Böhme as well, by the way.
Oh, really?
Heidegger did. Yeah, I mean, I would find it very hard to believe that he didn't read anything of Böhme. Yeah.
Hmm. Oh, really? All right. Yes. Well, there's another main theme in this chapter also that you deal with. It's quite fascinating, and it ties right into the Einstein-Minkowski 4D space-time model, and that is this idea of the three tenses of time, past, present, future, being compresent.
Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
And this is in Heidegger's thought, but also, say, in rabbinic thought and Kabbalistic thought.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
Now,
that's already in being in time.
mhm,
That idea. Yeah.
yes. And it was enlightening. Towards the end of that chapter, you actually quote from a piece by Gershom Scholem, right, where he's talking about Exodus 3:14's divine name, right, Echia, uh,
Right.
and he's pointing out, right, that the this contains, or reflects the present and the future, right, linguistically, and that's the
Right.
case in many languages, Indo-European and Semitic, right. The present can also express, right, the future. I mean, we do that in English as well, and but he develops an interesting thought from that, right, and that is that. Well, I don't want to get into his concept of the Messianic age, but it does sort of tie into it, and that is that
Hmm.
it's just, he says that the prophets are just engaging rhetorically when they speak about this Messianic age in the future, when what they're really talking about is something that is in the present. And of course, he's extrapolating this again from that divine name, uh,
Right.
right? This seemed to me very fascinating, although some of the places he took it, I think, were a little questionable, and maybe, you know, the influence from Hermann Cohen's neo-Kantian spin.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
because it's a very early text of Shalom.
mhm,
I think he's interpreting a passage from Hermann Cohen. Yeah.
mhm, yes, yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, yes. Yeah. So he says, so for God, right, time is always future, right, and the
Yeah.
eternal present is the permanent future. Um, then then he writes about die reale Unwirklichkeit, the real um, unrealness of the present, right? Um,
Uh,
and that the past and future are indistinguishable in the present. But it seems like he's really developing a very intriguing thought that has to do with the messianic question and the whole paradigm, right? That I think you've also developed, right, differently, sometimes invoking Kafka, right? And I can't remember the exact wording, but Kafka's comment about the Messiah will come the day after the last day.
If the Messiah will come the day after he's arrived, then Kafka glosses it, not the last day, but the very last day.
All right, all right, all right, right. And yes, I think somewhere in there too is the thought that the Messiah will come when he's not expected to come anymore. I'm not
Yeah,
sure where I'm
exactly.
getting that.
Yeah.
Um,
Or
yeah.
more cynically, there can never be a very last day.
Right. I don't know if we have to view that as cynical, right? If we base ourselves on what you were recording there from Sholem, seems it can also be profound. But I can see how it could be viewed cynically, right, from a certain perspective.
Yeah, well, if you, yeah, right, exactly. From a certain perspective, if you're, like, if if the messianism turns on an expectation
Hmm.
of the Messiah's coming, then it seems like what Kafka was saying, this can't transpire in time.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because can there be, well, I don't know. Let me ask you, can there be a very last day in time?
Well, I remember in a Zoom presentation, I think it was something where you were speaking, and this subject came up. And at one point, you told this young lady, "Whatever gets you through the night." You know, and I think sometimes when profound questions present themselves to us, sometimes that actually is a wise response. But let me be a little hazardous. All right. Um, you probably could anticipate, my own musings on this, because I would be basing them on Walter Benjamin, and
Uh-huh.
also a marvelous presentation interpreting Benjamin that uh, Agamben here in Italy gave some time ago. Um, but it seems to me that the uh, the idea of the messianic age, it doesn't seem to fit in with uh, historical reality, with history as such. It seems to be of a different order, and far be it from me to be able to identify what that would be. But it seems to me also that the messianic age could also, I would hazard to identify it also, it seems to be the same thing sometimes as the world to come, right? And so it doesn't seem to be something that will prevail within history or historical time,
Yeah.
right?
Well, early on, there was definitely a confusion of those two different taxonomies, and
Mhm,
much of medieval rabbinic literature was an effort to sort those things out.
mhm,
You
mhm,
know,
mhm.
is the Olam Haba different from the Yemot HaMashiach or the Atid Lavo? You know,
Mhm, mhm.
the future to come, is that the world to come, or is that the Messianic age?
Right,
Yeah.
right,
But
right.
when we get into the more philosophical intricacies, um, I think eventually Sholem acquiesced to the very point you were just making, namely, when he says, for instance, in his famous essay on the Messianic idea, which was written, a few years after the end of the Second World War and the
Mhm, mhm.
establishment of the modern state of Israel. He says about the Messianic idea that it's a life lived in deferment.
Mhm. Yes.
And it's a very pointed statement because he's there reflecting on Zionism and saying, let's not confuse the messianic ambition of the Zionists. Because if you make this modern state of Israel, as it's invoked in the traditional prayer to this day,
Mhm,
as the beginning of the redemption, then it's doomed to failure.
mhm.
because the messianic idea can't come to transpire in time. It
Hmm.
can't be realized in time.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I recall an even stronger statement, sort of related to this, right, from Noam Chomsky, in what was for me a surprising interview that he gave. I was surprised by just his the general points he was making, but there was this one statement where he pointed out that to that he does not love the state of Israel, because to love any state is reeks of polytheism, right?
Uh-huh.
It's a betrayal of monotheism. Uh, anyway, it's you know,
Well, it's
um,
interesting that he put it that way. Huh.
yes, rather bluntly that way, and that was an interview um,
Uh-huh.
that he gave to someone, well, in Israel. I forget exactly where they were living in Israel, but in any case, yeah, will there be a last day? Who am I to go there?
Well,
But
yeah, no, I understand. Who am I as well?
uh,
But I do think Kafka is sort of, first of all, is entirely paradoxical. The first part of the aphorism that the Messiah will come on the day after he has arrived. Now, what does that mean? What's the distinction there between coming and arrival? But right, and then the gloss only intensifies the mystery here because he says,
mhm.
right, no, not on the last day, but on the very last day.
Well, when we also, if we want to integrate into here the calm presence of the past, present, and future, right, there are certain questions, right, that probably cannot receive or be given a direct answer, right, because of the boundaries
Right,
of space and time, right, and
right,
everything we think and say, right, it's bounded, right, by space and time,
right,
and
right,
some quote unquote realities pertain to a state that right is probably typified by this calm presence, and
right.
so we can't express this directly. I like to use the example of the structure of because of the structure of the human eye. When we look um, at a particularly low magnitude star, right, in the night sky, it will fade from our vision. So we have to look at it through the periphery, and then it comes back into focus.
Uh-huh.
So that's a metaphor for me for that there are certain truths, quote unquote, that we cannot think of directly, and therefore we cannot talk about them directly. We can only use parables or allegories or analogies, or maybe even math. Sometimes we have to go about this in a very indirect way. And
Right.
so this is probably approaching that, but something does come to mind, right, from what Sholem was saying. When he's talking about the prophets, when they're talking about the messianic age, they're rhetorically placing it in the future, but they really are talking about the present. Well, that brings to mind that third logion in the Gospel of Thomas, and other sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, a later one, what you're looking for, the new world, again, right, the world to come, or is that the messianic age? But what you're looking for, it's already here.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't see it, and I don't take that to be a criticism. I think
Right.
it means that by its very nature, it cannot be seen. Right.
Right. Right.
So I mean, in Christian theology, it's called realized eschatology. I think
Real. Right.
Bultmann made that famous for his generation.
Yeah.
But that may be a little too simplistic, even that concept of realized eschatology. I don't think it really gets to the depths of this compresence, right, of the tenses of time. Um,
Well, well, here, listen to from that essay of Sholem. He touches upon what you're now, what you now brought to bear.
Mhm.
This is his language. Time is transformed through fusion. The past is in the future, and the future is in the past.
Mhm.
How does this happen? Through the vehicle of the present. And then he connects it with the grammatical point of the vav hipuch,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, right.
It translates the future into the present. Is that right? Do I have
Mm.
that right?
Right, right, and and the main point I think there, as far as temporality goes, is when he writes that the present is die reale Unwirklichkeit. It's the real unreal.
Yeah, he says that earlier. Right, right.
Right, and so
The
it's
actual unreality, the
yeah.
reality
So right,
Unwirklichkeit.
as you
Right.
point out, that's obviously an oxymoron,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
but nonetheless profound. Um,
Right,
you know,
right. But he does seem to be getting at a compressance here, right?
yes, yes,
Fusion of the future and the past through the present,
yes,
through the
yes.
vehicle of the present or the medium of the present.
Right. And so the messianic age he's implying is something of the present. And so the question
It's
is,
the
what
right.
is that an enduring present?
Well, I think it's what invoking the Gospel of Thomas. I think that's similar kind of sensibility here. I mean, it is it it is already it is already. How do I sometimes put it? Today is tomorrow because tomorrow is today. But not everybody sees that.
Right. Right. Of course not. And it is ironic. There's a passage in the Synoptic Gospels, like Matthew, right, where Jesus is made to say, in that day, having to paraphrase, right? 20 years ago, I could have probably quoted it word for word, but in that day, people are going to be saying, look, the Messiah is out in the desert. Look, the Messiah is in this inner chamber. But don't believe them. The Messiah will not be here, and the Messiah will not be there. And of course, the Christians don't have a problem with that because they read it eschatologically or apocalyptically. Oh, sure, yeah. But from a Jewish perspective, it looks like a traditional, at least from one Jewish perspective, it looks like a traditional way of understanding this deferment, right?
Yeah.
This permanent deferment of the coming of the Messiah. So, even with what the Christians call the first coming of the Messiah,
Right.
this point that Jesus is made to say seems really, intriguing, probably problematic, the way I'm interpreting it for Christians. But I don't mean any offense, right? Not at all. Um, but it brings to mind. More than one Jewish writer has invoked this beautiful line from the Song of Solomon, right? Don't how's it?
Arouse love. Yeah.
Don't arouse love, and don't hasten it before its time is one way we could translate it. But if we want to make this even more challenging, right, we could go back to this point I asked you about, of how Heidegger sometimes, at least within a single sentence, he will identify um, temporality and imagination.
An imagination. Yeah.
And now, I'm not claiming this is exactly what he means, but this is how I process that for myself, right? And that is that I've often wondered, right, is consciousness, so I'll jump from imagination to consciousness. It's not the same thing, I know, but let's go there. Um, I've often wondered if time, or temporality, and consciousness are really the same thing, right?
Say that again quickly. If time and consciousness are the same thing, would you
Yeah,
say?
if if,
Yeah.
if if they coincide at some point,
Yeah.
and when I step back and look at it, of course, I can immediately begin to pick it apart philosophically. But I think that there's something in there that works for me at least, and that is that, well, consciousness, right, is certainly bound within, space time.
Oh yeah.
Trying
Well,
to get to is is your something you hint at in this book when you mention dream. But so my point is that is the irreality, right, which is real at the same time, right? The irreality of all of this, our consciousness and space and time, and the universe, and our experience. I think it's real and irreal, right, simultaneously. This is the subject, right, of your dream book, right, the dream within a dream. Uh,
Yeah,
and I don't want to summarize it in my own words, but for me, that's how I encapsulate it for my own thinking. It's like, yeah, the real has this aspect of the irreal, and the irreal has this aspect of you can't have one without the other, right?
right, right.
And so there is this dreamlike quality to the universe, right? And this calm presence of the three tenses of time really brings that home, right? For me, at least conceptually. And so when we then address this question, right, will there be a last day? And all of this, it all sort of, it's everything's on a different level now, a more basic, a more fundamental level, right? So now it's like, yeah,
Yeah,
what is existence? What is being? What is this universe? What is our conscious experience of it?
yeah,
And so if it's all dreamlike, right, everything gets turned on its head. Everything gets looked at from a new perspective, and questions assume different levels of importance and significance. I don't know if I expressed myself sanely there or not. Um,
yeah. Well, no, you did, and you capture what I tried to do in the dream book very well. I think I might add just I was trying to articulate the ancient wisdom of waking from the dream of waking,
mhm, mhm, mhm.
which
Right.
again would blur the line between reality and irreality, which is to be distinguished from unreality.
Mhm, right.
Yeah. I, uh, as far as Heidegger, I mean, he would put it to go back to uh, the beginning of your last set of comments. He would put it that the ontological structure of Dasein is grounded in temporality, Zeitlichkeit,
Mhm,
and that is constituted always from the site of the moment, right, of Dasein, the being there. Now,
mhm.
but in that moment, there is there is something of a privileging of future,
Yes.
but there's also at the same time a compressence of the three temporal ecstasies, as he calls them.
Mhm, mhm,
Now, that compressence constitutes what he calls the authentic sense of time or temporality,
mhm,
as
mhm,
opposed to the vulgar
mhm.
sense of time, which is predicated on a sharper delineation of past, present, and future.
All right. Mhm,
Now, I just wanted to mention here the provocative question with which he ends being in time, or the part of being in time that he completed, because he never actually completed the second part.
mhm, mhm.
He says, "Does time itself reveal itself as the horizon of being?" So he leaves us with that question.
I, I I think so. And the conclusion I draw for myself, yeah, is that there's something simultaneously real and unreal about this temporality. Um, uh,
Well, unreal because of the compressants, or unreal because it should be opposed to something like timelessness or eternality?
It's related to that, but I would qualify that. And what I would get at is the Minkowski-Einstein 4D concept of the block universe. All right, so the universe is this frozen 4D structure, right, where there is this compresence of the three tenses of time. So this is the exact opposite of presentism, right? The idea that only the present exists. The past used to exist, but it no longer exists. The future is yet to exist, right? So in the block universe, the all three tenses have equal ontological amplitude, right?
Right.
Back to your question, why unreal? Because of, according the model of the block universe, the experience of the passage of time, right? That is considered on one level to be an illusion, and the reality is that actually all the three tenses have equal ontological weight, right? And so it's just a, a, a limitation of human consciousness, right? That's at play there. We can experience, right, one slice of time, right, followed by another slice of time. We cannot expand our consciousness to experience the past and the future at the same time, right? And so I believe it was Weil, yes, Weil, who had that famous comment about, well, what happens is that consciousness crawls along the world line, right, bit by bit, and this conscious experience of second by second by second by second, right, is that's right. There's something, right, that would be seen as an illusion, and the eternal state, the 4D block world, would be the reality. Now, my problem with all of that language is this sharp bifurcation between illusion and reality. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me that Ernst Cassirer hit it the nail on the head, as they say, when he wrote that long essay on Einstein's theory of relativity shortly after it was published. And he pointed out that, all right, so Einstein is telling us that the flow of time is an illusion, right? We live in this 4D block
Right.
world.
Right.
But he says, so that cannot be a complete theory of the universe, because a complete theory would also have to explain our experience of time.
Right.
And physics, Einstein doesn't do that, so it's certainly not a full theory. So I sort of cheat and say, all right, I have the full theory, and that is that, right, you can't separate the real and the irreal, ultimately. Uh,
Mm.
and so, right, if we want to invoke Plato's allegory of the cave, to get back to a point you made, um, about waking from the hope of waking, I guess I would say it in my own words. That is, um, my friend Solomon pointed this out to me. He teaches his students the allegory of the cave this way. All right, so everyone they get thrown out of the cave, basically, and then they realize, they see the sun. Oh, we're free, and now we know that those shadows on the wall in the cave that we saw. All right, we've been freed from all of that, right? But what actually has happened now is that they're just in another cave. In the other cave, there happens to be a sun in the sky, right? So you're still in a cave, because ultimately all of our experience goes through this epistemological filter of our consciousness. We can't escape that.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what I often phrase in terms of there is no naked truth, right? There's only there's
Mhm.
only truth that is garbed, right, in the veil of truth, which is indeed the veil of untruth, which brings us back to another critical Heideggerian motif,
Hmm. Hmm.
that truth and untruth are inextricably bound.
Right.
And by the way, his reading of the uh, myth of the cave in the Republic is that when one is liberated from the shadows
Hmm.
and sees the sunlight, one really comes to understand that the shadow is itself an inflection of the light, but that
Hmm.
there isn't really a sharp dichotomy between the light and the shadow,
Right. Right.
which I think goes along with what you were suggesting.
Right. And that brings to mind, being a native of California, right? Growing up in the 70s, I heard a lot, of Hindu Hare Krishna enthusiasts, right? And their line was, and again, I'm not criticizing them, but their line was frequently, um, everyone, we're living in an illusion. We're dreaming. We need to wake up from the dream. We need to get out of the illusion into the reality, right?
Yeah,
And my point to them was always, look, well, what if this dream, you wake up from it and you're just in another dream,
you're in another dream. Exactly.
and it
Yeah.
never ends, right?
Yeah.
It's this endless cycle, which is sort of, I don't know, but that's a model that appeals to me.
It's a labyrinth of dreams. You're exactly so.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
again, that's what I mean. You could truth. I mean, we have this idea of naked truth,
Hmm.
but I think it's philosophically very questionable because truth always has to be rendered visible through some cloak of
Right,
invisibility.
right. The way I've phrased it is, let's say if, plug in whatever one wants to, man or woman, but if a man loves a woman, um, and wants to get to the essence of that woman, I mean, what are you going to do? She can remove her clothes and be naked. Um, what more can you do? What more of an inner essence can you get to without then removing the corpus and killing the person? Right. Right. The you know
Uh,
uh, right. So I guess on a certain point, that could become an example of phenomenology, right? Question of direct experience as opposed to getting at some supposed essence, right, apart from the
well, yeah,
appearance. But you want to get to the essence of this woman. Well, you can remove the clothes, and that's about all you can do.
but yeah,
Uh,
well, the naked body is the greatest of garments.
yes, yes, exactly. That's my point. You're just better with words than I am. Uh, um, but I did have a colleague who's a physicist write me an email a couple of days ago, and he was commenting on your work, that he very much is entranced by your ideas about the veil, and he ended the email with, why the veil, right? But I think you've just answered, that question, right? And
Well, well, what do you mean? Why the veil? What's the option here?
yeah, exactly. Right. So he had repeated your main idea, right? That you've encapsulated, right? That about every veiling is an unveiling, every unveiling is a veiling,
Yeah.
and et cetera, et cetera. And so, right, it makes sense to him. And I so I think that because this is a relatively new way for him to think, that he's still at the end. Yeah, but why the veil? He's really
Uh-huh.
struggling with, why is the world this way? Why is reality this way?
Well,
Yeah, yeah. Uh, it's. I think my response to him would be, it's like the woman, or the man. You take the clothes off, and you still got a veil there. You
Yeah.
want to see the inside, you're going to kill them. I mean, wait till
Yeah.
they're dead and open up the cadaver, but to
Right.
be blunt. So, no,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you.
yes. Anyway, it seems that we're probably running out of time here. Um,
Okay.
it's just, um, I appreciate your time. Uh,
It's my pleasure. I appreciate I appreciate it as well. To your time, I appreciate your time as well. Um,
yes,
you know, it's nice to be engaged in a dialogue.
yes, it always is.
Yeah.
And I really can't think of anyone. Well, you're certainly at the top of my list, right, for those to engage in dialogue with. And to expand my own horizons, but which they have been expanded by your work. And I wish you many more years of productivity. I think the world will benefit, right, from your work and from your future work. So all
Well,
best wishes, Elliot.
thank you for that, Samuel.